Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Microsoft Principal Technical Trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide for this Learning Path 6, Implementing User Authentication and Authorization. This learning path is broken up into 4 individual modules, which will be 4 different recordings, where we're going to first of all start with exploring what is Microsoft Identity Platform. We'll take a look at the broad spectrum of Microsoft Entra ID and the ways that security works. So this is going to be a foundation unit for the rest of the recordings. We're then going to take a look at implementing authentication by using the Microsoft Authentication Library, ways in which you can deploy it and get benefits of providing a more secure application. We're going to implement the shared access signature, which is one way to gain access to resources. And this has been covered from a usage perspective in other recordings where we actually showed you how to generate a SAS token, maybe to get to a storage account. This is going to pull these together from an application perspective. And we're going to introduce you to the Microsoft Graph, the set of APIs that allows you to have access to the entire Microsoft data estate environment. Starting with module number 1, exploring the Microsoft Identity Provider, this is where we're going to cover off some of the foundations about identity and the platform which we use in the modern cloud environment. Now, Microsoft, we talk about identity being the new perimeter of security, and there's some fundamental changes that have happened over time as we've moved to the cloud. For many decades, our on-premises model was based around a thing called Kerberos and NTLM. These were dedicated technologies that were open source, that were available, that did a really great job for many, many decades providing authentication and authorization for us. But there were some fundamental flaws that we couldn't change. We could patch and make sure that there was no holes. But my analogy I would use, this is like an internal combustion car. It's still a car, but there's some things from the engine or the power processing that you have that you could make it more efficient. You can make it faster or smaller, lighter, whatever you want. But that car versus an electric car, the engine itself is fundamentally different. And that's really what we want to take a look at in this module, is looking at the identity platform, how it differs. And we're going to introduce some of these things called service principles into this model. So some of this terminology you're going to understand because it comes from a legacy environment of users and groups. But we're going to introduce a whole new set of IDs and security principles that we have in this modern model in OpenID, OAuth, OData, which is the foundation of the cloud environment. So what we did is when we moved from on-premises to the cloud, we kept the whole concept of security and identity, but we changed the underlying technologies that were powering them. So we're going to get in and take a look at the identity platform. And to do that best, I want to go off, as I have in other recordings, is I want to do a bit of whiteboarding to give you some of the grounding work. We're going to go into the platform and actually see some of this in action, and then we'll come back to the slides and we'll review that information and follow it up with some additional information, from a knowledge perspective. I think it's important that we get some background to identity and how it has fundamentally changed in the cloud and specifically inside of Azure. And so these are some grounding principles that I think will help you get into the specific areas that are covered in this course. Inside of Microsoft Azure, that cloud resource, we've got several versions of the cloud that we're dealing with. And you're going to see up here, we have the public cloud as the central focus point that we've been covering that most people have access to. We've got other versions of this that are called sovereign clouds that are available to specific environments. For example, we've got one for the US government, both at the federal, state, and local levels that are separate implementations, but follow the same principles. So I'm not going to cover that too much. Now, a term that you're going to hear quite a bit about is Azure is a multi-tenanted environment. And so you can have multiple tenants in this common public interface and access to Azure. You've probably seen in other recordings where I talked about how you interact with Azure on a global basis. Doesn't matter. You come through this thing called that ARM layer, regardless of where those resources are in the world, you come through that common interface. The same thing from an identity perspective we're going to take a look at. But you can have multiple tenants in here, and you're going to hear us use the terms of, is it B2B or business to business using tenants? Do you have multiple tenants in your own company? Are you dealing with partner companies? Or are you going to B2C or business to consumer? And I'll give you some examples of this. So the key word here is you have a tenant. Now within the tenant in a multi-tenanted environment, we're going to focus in on a single tenant And within that tenant, you get two specific areas: resource management and security principal management. Those two areas break down, read some of this, into what are called scopes. And this is going to be an important concept to understand when we start talking about the authorization. So authentication and authorization are two parts of a whole picture. Authentication, proving who you are, and once you've been authenticated, then you can be authorized to perform something, which are the permission sets that come along that grant you access to be able to do something. Now, these flow down, and this is kind of a standard Microsoft feature. Child objects inherit things from a parent object as a general rule inside of Microsoft across all of our products and services. And so we want to understand what the scopes are inside of Azure so that where we assign them, and your application may then try and use, it may come from this understanding of how permissions flow down using these scopes. Now, when you take a look at the scopes that are available inside of Azure from the resource management side, there's a thing called a management group. This is going to be beyond the level of many of you as developers, but within a management group, you can have up to 10,000 management groups in a model that's 7/6 layers deep. Now, the books might say 6 that you control, but there's a top level called the tenant root management group. And this allows an organization to build a hierarchical structure that meets their requirements from an organizational perspective. I've got many multinational companies that I do work with, that they maybe say that this is our parent company, but I maybe have to worry about GDPR rules in Europe. So I'm going to have a European division. I've got North American rules. So I got a North American regulations. So I'm going to have a North American division. And so you could actually map an organizational structure with these 10,000 groups up to 7 layers deep that could provide that capability. And I could give somebody permission at the top level, and in a parent-to-child relationship, that would start to flow down. Below a management group, you then get a thing called a subscription. A subscription is a billing construct, and you've seen us use this in other recordings as a way to pay for services. You can have multiple subscriptions, and you can assign them to the different management groups. And again, this parent-child relationship, that if I, as a user down here working with a virtual machine, that might be billed to a subscription based on a management group structure or to the parent level, just a way for us to be able to pay for things. So we have subscriptions in our scope level. Below subscriptions, we get a thing called a resource group. You've seen that through all these different recordings, and we'll be doing some in this session where we build a resource group, and then we put resources in that resource group built to that subscription. And inside of the resource group, we get the actual resources. That parent-to-child relationship is going to then have a set of permissions that are going to be associated with that. And we're going to talk about this term called RBAC. Now, the authentication portion of this model, authentication and authorization, comes from the security principles that are managed through a thing called Entra ID. You might have heard a term of Azure Active Directory. That's a legacy name that has been retired for a while, but we now refer to it as Entra ID to show the ongoing progression of modern identity management. So these are the two pieces that we're working with. Now, I want to focus in on this term called security principal management for just a second. I think I've said in other recordings that there's some things that drive me a little bit crazy about Microsoft, and it's the way in which we name things. We have a term, and you've seen this in other recordings. You'll hear me use the term RBAC, role-based access control, IAM, identity access management, and access control. All three of those terms are exactly the same thing. Why don't we have one name for all of them? But we don't. So let's go through. And I want to be very clear in some of these names that we're going to be using because they sound familiar and similar, but they may mean different things. I'm going to be using the term identity and identity management. That is very, very similar, and we see that security principle term. They, for in my discussion, are all intents and purposes the same thing. And in many cases they are. There's some slight differences in their definition, but for all intents and purposes, identity and security principles are the same thing. In this hierarchical structure, we then get what are called user principles and service principles. So you can see security principles and service principles sound the same thing. They're not. A service principle is an instance of a security principle, but also is a user principle. Now, some of the user principles that you might be familiar with are users. User accounts that you've been creating and using for many years. This is your username and password that you're working with. We have devices. Many of you might have Windows domain joined devices, and we've had those for decades in the on-premises world using domain controllers. And so devices used to be domain joined. And they only could be Windows devices. In this modern world, we've now gone from domain joined, we just call that joined, and we now have what are called registered devices. Registered devices allow us for a broader spectrum of devices that we can work with. These become your mobile devices, your iOS and your Android. They become Linux boxes. They become Mac OSs. Provides for a wider range of devices to be then managed under an identity provider, because now in a mobile world, and why I'm talking about this is your application might exist in more environments than where it used to have, where you had a domain joined computer given to you by your company getting an application that was written for you. We have multiple ways to work with this. It's a web device. It's a web application that's accessed by a mobile device is not even owned by you. So all of these different devices all fall under the identities that we're working with. And you heard me use the term identity as the new perimeter of security. So we set security at the identity, and it might be a user, because the identity of Bob working at my company, which I've been authenticated with, is a different persona on a secure device in a secure network. Because Bob on that secure device in a public Wi-Fi environment is a different secure environment, which I might not allow them access to certain information. And this is why this granular control is going to be very important for us. We also got groups. So those fall under the category of user principles. When we went to the cloud and this new OAuth OpenID model, and you're going to hear us use the word SAML and OpenID, these standards introduced a new set of identities under the form of service principles. And we now have applications. Some of you might have come from an era, as I did, where we used to have to create a user account with a username and password that we would give to an application that would have to be stored securely for that application. You would never put that into your code. You might put it in a control file or find some secure way to pass that identity off to the application. But we now have a capability to actually have an application registered inside of Microsoft Entra ID. You're going to see extensively covered in this recording as well as other ones. We're going to take a look at what are called managed identities. And there's two forms of managed identities called system assigned and user assigned. So that's showing the landscape of the type of identities that we want to take a look at. So we have identities in general that are broken up into two major categories of user principal and service principles. User principles are made up of our standard users, groups, and devices. And then we've got a new set of devices that cover a broader range of your mobile devices of iOS and Android, as well as other operating systems like Linux and your Mac OSs. This new service principal capability provides for applications in a legacy model to have enterprise applications have an identity, and a whole new set of identities under the managed identity model of system assigned and user assigned, which I'm going to go into more depth in this lesson itself. Now, I want to do just a small demonstration of how this comes into play, and we're going to do some of this as we go through this, as well as the corresponding recordings that make up this Learning Path series. I'm going to come to a learning partner of Microsoft's, and the company is currently called Skillable. They used to be called Learn on Demand Systems, and you'll see that represented in the URL path up at the top. So if you come to this website, you'll see a location where it's going to authenticate you and ask you to log in. So here's a web application running in some web server on the internet that I can now come to sign in. Now you're seeing a variety of different IDs that I could use to sign in. And so I can log in with a Microsoft account. We do more conversation of this in a few minutes, but this becomes a Microsoft account is referred to as one of our public domain accounts. It's something at outlook.com, at live.com, at hotmail.com, or at msn.com. Those 4 public domain namespaces, if you have one of those, what it would do is you would give it that username and password. Now, many of you have probably done this for years. You use that username. In my case, I use my outlook.com account. I go to some place, I register, and it says create a password for it. So I'm using that name, but they're keeping a password unique to it. This is actually going to use my account managed by Microsoft at the outlook.com domain. It's going to use that to authenticate me and bring me back to Learn on Demand Systems, because it's going to accept the authentication of a user at a different realm from a security perspective than where you're actually going to use that ID. I could go to a Microsoft Entra ID, which is then going to go off to Azure, and it's going to then authenticate that user against an Azure tenant. So you give it some name with maybe your first name, last name at your company name. It then goes to the Azure resource and looks for the Microsoft tenant that has that domain name registered for it. It then goes to that tenant that then authenticates that user at the tenant level and comes back to Skillable, in this case, to say, hey, I've authenticated them. You can now go off and authorize this person to use resources. And so it was authenticated by somebody else, but it's now authorizing that within the Skillable world, because it says, I'm now going to let that person take this course, or I'm going to let this person take that course. Now you're seeing somewhere in the background here, depending on what I was logged in with. So I've got my name here. It's coming to my domain, and I was able to pick, because it's my domain, I've registered it. I can actually come and use my own background, and you can see the picture of the Starship Enterprise in the back. So I'm going to authenticate to my domain, and it brings me back to Skillable then to then authorize me to be able to perform an activity inside of their environment. Now, the last piece here was, if I went back, was I could actually log in with the Skillable account. This is going to go to their environment in that traditional manner, where they're going to create a username and password for me in their environment that they can control that. So there's an example of a modern authentication model using the different values we just talked about of this modern identity that is either going to be picked up in your tenant, maybe a business-to-business tenant, or maybe going to a third-party federated provider of an identity. So that's a bit of a long conversation around identities themselves. I'm going to come out into Microsoft Entra ID, and you're going to see some of these services that we just were talking about. I've got a tenant here. I've got a tenant ID, and it's got some primary domain name. And I could then register the name that is on Microsoft.com. You'll see even Microsoft is Microsoft.onMicrosoft.com. And by proving that they own the name Microsoft.com, it would then allow you to then use that domain name as a way to register or authenticate against this tenant. So if I come into the company branding, that's where I was able to put it in my tenant, be able to get in and brand it and use the Star Trek Enterprise as my background. But I can actually have custom domain names where I could then register those domain names. You could say EIEIO. I haven't been able to verify that I own that name, but if I could call this EIEIO.com. Now, taking a look at those different identities, I've got my users, I've got my groups, I've got my external identities that you're working with, and there are currently a number of other business to consumer. I could be authenticated by a Facebook account. I could be authenticated by other identity providers that all fall into this OpenID model. I think there's 31 at last count at the time of this recording, that you could then use their identity and authentication process to then accept it as a valid authentication process back in this environment. There's my devices. You can see I've got my application registrations and my application IDs. We've got a whole set of that information available to me in Microsoft Azure using the Entra ID. Now, one last piece I want to talk about before I get back into the book pieces. I've mentioned the term RBAC. RBAC, or the role-based access control, is how we assign privileges, permissions to objects. Now, I have a bit of a soapbox I like to stand on. I often have people ask me the question, hey, Bob, can you give me the rights to do something? And I say, no, I'll give you the permission. They go, they're the same thing. Permissions and rights are not the same thing. I'm not going to get into a long conversation about them now, but permissions and rights are two different capabilities, and you want to be very careful that you do not over-provision. Rights supersede permissions, just to give you a bit of a hint. So if you want to explore that further, try and figure out what the differences are between rights and permissions. And maybe you could use something like Copilot to actually, now that you know it, say, hey, Copilot, I heard that rights and permissions in Microsoft are different. Can you give me an explanation of what that is? That would be a good use of Copilot. So RBAC, or the role-based access control, is predicated on three bubbles that you see here: who, what, and where. So the who become identities. And that's that full set of identities that I just talked about, of user identities, devices, groups, and the system assigned and managed identities. That's the who. So identities, and the term is called assigned, are assigned to a what, and these whats are roles. Now, there's two types of roles. There are built-in roles, and there's custom roles. Custom roles are roles that you build, that you manage. The Microsoft built-in roles are ones that Microsoft manages. You then assign that to a where, which becomes that term scope. So hopefully this brings it full circle. You're going, what the heck is Bob talking about scopes for? So now I assign a who, an identity, to a what, a role. Are you an administrator, or do you have read permissions to something? So you are a storage account reader. So that's a role that you have, to the scope of either, we talked about as management groups, we talked about subscriptions, we talked about resource groups, and then within the resource groups. So if I assign a user a role at the management group level, by default, that will inherit all the way through to the child object. So it would get it at that management group, all the sub-management groups, at the subscriptions at those management groups, at the resource groups assigned to that subscription, and then at the resources in that resource group. So that shows you the overall picture, and you're going to have to see where your application plays in here and the type of identity that you're going to need to provide the authentication for your application itself. Now, one final piece that I want to give you before I go back to the slides. You can pause the screen and get these URLs. You can just type it into the search engine of your choice, or better yet, you might want to ask the question of Copilot. But I want to point you to a couple of links that you may want to reference to get deeper learning into the content that we're covering here. The first one is talking about this identity fundamentals, and it's going to talk about some of the things that we just covered. What is identity access management fundamentals? What is an IAM? That's that identity access management. What is an identity? You're seeing some of that similar nomenclature that I was using, and it flows through all those capabilities. The next thing you want to start to do is going to get more into the application development and use of some of these. So the next one is going to talk about an overview of permissions and consent in the identity platforms. And this is going to talk about some of the app consents that you might want to have. And we're going to talk about access on behalf of a user. So what happens if a user who has an identity uses an application that also has an identity? What is that flow that we're working at? Now, as a general rule, within the Microsoft security model, permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So in this realm of what we're just talking about, let's say a user was assigned two different groups. He is the HR user and he's the HR manager. So as the HR user and the HR manager is two different groups that user belongs to, they would have the permissions of those two groups. So permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So that user, as both being an HR user that gives them read access to all the HR files and the HR manager that gives them maybe write permissions that the HR users don't have, it gives them write access to those files, that user, as the HR manager, would have access to read, write all the files in HR. But then I think if you want to pause for just a second and think, what file might you not want that user to be able to get in and make changes to? I won't wait too long. You might not want them changing their own. So by putting a deny on that person's individual file, they can read, write all files in the HR system except their own, because permissions are cumulative with the exception of deny. Now, what happens then when I have two applications that are working together? So I've got a user using an application gaining access to some resources. And we're going to do a small dive into some of these, but it's something that you may want to go a bit deeper in to understand what the effect is. Now, these come from different realms. So a user using an application, depending on how you set it up, a user might have full control to something, but using that application only has read access. They will get the least permission in this case. So now a user who has full control to potentially do something, if you now force them to use an application that has deprecated permissions, they could potentially have only read access to that. So this is going to get into some of those concepts about authorizing that information and authenticating it. Now, this is the deeper learning that's going to get into all the content that I'm going to cover in this module. And it's going to talk about, there's that OAuth 2 that I was talking about, and the protocol details of getting into the different formats on behalf of device code flows, impact grant flows, resource owners. So these are going to be terms you're going to see coming up in this module as we get into, as an application developer, how does authentication and authorization apply to you? So there's the background to the introduction to what identity platforms are and where it comes from. A bit deeper than what the course is going to go to, but I think that if I hadn't done that, if you're not familiar with it, they would just be a bunch of words and you might not be able to tie them together. So hopefully that's going to give you some background of what it is that this slide is showing you. Inside of this new world of a cloud-based environment, we have the MSOL libraries, or the Microsoft identity providers. Now, this is our implementation of an industry standard. It's all based on OpenID, OAuth, WSFed. These are standard industry protocols that now work. And that's what allows you to go to Facebook. If you have a game that crushes candies on your phone, you could actually authenticate against a Facebook identity and then come back and crush candies. That then goes to a database at that crushing candy company and tells you what levels and how many candies you've crushed and what your score is. And I understand why they may want to do that, because they probably want you to publish your scores back to your Facebook so you get more promotion of your achievements, but also promoting their app by using your identity that allows them to publish that information to Facebook. So that's kind of the idea of this OpenID. It's a standard that they're working with. You see that down at the bottom there. So we've got our MSOL libraries that you're working with that you can now implement. Now, I've mentioned in other recordings that by default, this MSOL library and the infrastructure has been built into some of the platform as a service offerings. If you use that traditional application deployment of infrastructure as a service, where you have to build a virtual machine and you're going to build the environment and deploy your application there, that's all on you. If you go to the platform as a service capabilities, if you go to the container instances or the container apps or the app service plans, or you go to AKS, a lot of these capabilities, as you configure them, they gave you the capability to have the authentication engines automatically or available by default. And so what we have is that capability to work with that Microsoft Entra endpoints that I was just showing you. That's for the authentication component that then will allow you to grant authorization. Down at the very bottom of this, you take a look at the Microsoft Entra ID. That's the identity provider that's built into your tenant that you're working with. Now, you saw, and the term, we called them Microsoft accounts. That's the second line there. That's the ones that are at outlook.com, at live.com, at hotmail.com, or at msn.com. I could go to one of those to be authenticated. The first bullet point gets into a work or school account. That's the one that was the middle button in that example I gave you at Skillable. You saw that as I brought it brought up the bob@tickelman.com domain name, and it automatically went to the Microsoft identity provider for all of Azure and says, is this an identity across Microsoft Entra ID as either a work or school ID that somebody owns a tenant, and you're going to go to that tenant to be authenticated. And you saw that it was trying to point towards mine. Now, if I didn't put a default account in there, probably shouldn't have, it would just bring me to a standard landing page. I wouldn't see that image of the Starship Enterprise in the background, but because it came up by default with a pre-built user account, it started to find that identity. Now, the other capability is working into that B2C and the business to consumer, which opens up the identities to those third-party or industry standards. So going to Facebook or going to Google or coming to some of the other identity providers in a business to consumer model, where yes, I'm going to not just an Outlook.com or Hotmail, I'm going to a third-party provider's version of their public domain namespaces that they're working with. Here we're getting into the concepts of some of those features I talked about. Remember, we talked about identities, that word service principals. Below the service principles, you had security principles. This is showing you that chart. Maybe I should flip back there just to remind you for just a second. Let me do that. Here we have security principles and our service principles. So that's the concept that we were showing you. Go back here. And now what we have is service principles. The service principles, you'll see that there's a single tenant or multi-tenant. Can it access your tenant, or is it going to be multiple tenants that you're working with? We have application objects, and we have service principles for the identity management. You've got legacy, and the identity management pieces are going to be those system assigned and user assigned relationships. You're seeing down below, this comes up on another screen as well, that one-to-one relationship allows you to assign an identity to an application. You also have the ability to assign what is called a system assigned managed identity, which has a one-to-one relationship. That identity is assigned to one application that you're working with, or deployment of that service, not just an application. And they share a common lifecycle, where I have what's called a user assigned managed identity, which is that one-to-many capability. They don't share a common lifecycle. If the application goes away, the identity sticks around. It's still up to you to manage that identity. Now, as application developers, probably not your job to manage identities, but if you do have that capability, you might be told that we want you to use a system assigned so that as you build your application and deploy it, it could automatically create a system assigned managed identity. That account goes away, or the application goes away, so does the account that is associated with it. So when you take a look at the permission types that we talked about, so in the identity platform, this is where I talked about roles. There are a predefined set of roles that are in there. There's a couple of thousand of them by default. And so Microsoft manages these roles that you could also then modify to meet your own specific permission sets. In a future recording, I'm going to go in and show you, there's a role, something like the global administrator has something like 1,500 permissions associated with it. It can read this, it can write this in all the discrete pieces that you're working with across the totality of Azure. So, some of these roles have quite a few permissions that are associated with them. And then we can have app-only access permissions that you can assign and build specific roles for your app. Now, when you get into this consent type, this gets into those flows that I was showing you, and there's three specific ones. There's a static user consent, there's an incremental and dynamic user consent, and then there's admin consent. And I've built a chart that hopefully will describe some of this for you. So what they're talking about here is on the far left-hand side, a static user consent. Your application is going to request a token from its with its initial permissions. That is going to then be assigned to the application, and with that token comes along the permissions that the application. So it's a static user consent. So that's the permissions that they've been granted through that connection. In that incremental and dynamic user consent, the application gets a consent, very similar to that far left-hand side one, but now a user using that application is also going to bring a set of credentials that they've provided from a user consent perspective. And then what happens as the combined unit of those go through to gain the applications that they're working with. And so these are just giving you some of those examples that I was showing you on behalf of the different permissions that you're working with. You're going to have to understand what is happening when an application has a consent, a user has a consent. What happens if they're in conflict? One has more permissions than the other. What is the case? And that goes back to some of those standard rules I was talking about of the least permission in this case is typically what the benefit or the end results is going to be. When you take a look at the OpenID, these are terms I mentioned, and the OAuth authorizations, this is giving you an example of some of the code that might do some of these features from a programmatics perspective, making the requests that you're trying to do from an application perspective to get the authentication and the authorizations that are going to grant the permissions to gain access to another application or to some resources, data possibly, maybe it's a storage account to get the pictures to put on your webpage. All of that becomes that perimeter of security that we've been talking about, where you want to make sure that each individual application, and this becomes where this is so important for us, especially to have system assigned managed identities. If you take a look at modern applications that are used in a microserviced environment, each individual application can now have its own identity. Where in the past, in a monolithic world where you had a monolithic application that did everything, that one identity was assigned to the entirety of the application. You didn't have this fine-grained application capability and control. So now with this new model, and you see me use this example possibly in other recordings, now with this model with my front end, that front end website in the upper left-hand corner needs access to a storage account to put the pictures on the web page that come from a SQL backend. This application might need some permissions. It needs to go to, in this case, I'm using a cache system that has a list of all the products that I want to list. That's going to then give back the list of the products that you have to go then to the image file to get all the images of all those pictures that you want to list. All that information is going to potentially need permissions to be able to read, write, modify at different levels. In the case to be able to write something into the storage of where your shopping cart is going to be, I need the read-write capabilities of that, but I may only need read access to the data store where the images are. So this granular control at the application level becomes a huge part of that new perimeter of security that we wanted to implement at the application level. One of the benefits that you get with Microsoft Entra ID is a conditional access capability. And I mentioned this early on in the recording. We often talk about a persona, and I mentioned the example of Bob as a user at Microsoft who authenticates against Microsoft Identity. I get an identity, and I might have all sorts of permissions, but we have different personas because Bob on my secure device given to me by Microsoft that's controlled by them and they patch it on a secure network in Microsoft gaining access to some significant research, maybe that happens. But Bob on this secure device at a public Wi-Fi environment connected through VPN might not have access to that information. Or me on my mobile phone, I don't have access to that information. So conditional access provides for this capability of having these different personas that might say, gosh, you know what, Bob? Yeah, you're connected through a VPN, but you're in an unsecure environment. I don't know if it's really you. You logged on, but I'm not going to require multi-factor authentication. So I didn't use that initially. So now I can elevate the level of credential authentication. I've gone from a conditional access where I initially only required a username, but I'm trying to access secure information from an unsecure location. I then come into a multi-factor authentication requirement that says, I need you to provide me either a biometric or maybe a verification code that's on your phone. So all of this comes through this new modern method to be able to provide security at the perimeter around the identities and their usage. So that brings module 1 to an end as an introduction. These concepts are going to flow through the next remaining modules, and you'll get an opportunity to do some of this in other recordings. But right now, let's close out this module with our knowledge check. So question number 1, which of the types of permissions supported by the Microsoft Identity Platform is used by apps that have a signed-in user present? Go ahead, pause the recording for just a second. So that is that delegated user. We saw that, in that 3 options that we had. So I can now delegate, say, listen, the application might not have any permissions. I'm going to take the permissions of the user who's authenticated and then use that delegated permission to be able to access the resources based on the user's permission to those the information that, I might give one user read access to something, but another user logging into the same application might have read write. So question number 2. What app scenarios require code to handle conditional access challenges? Go ahead and stop the recording for a second. So those would be apps that perform on behalf of. So it's going to perform the app on behalf of it. It's going to then require that user to potentially pass some conditional access to be able to gain access to the resources that it's working with. So that brings Module 1 to a close. We've taken a look at identity in this modern world and how it's fundamentally changed from the on-premises world using Kerberos and NTLM. We're now moving to OpenID, OAuth, OData, WSFed as a fundamentally different way to provide this well-known identity authentication and authorization. It provides for a wider range of identity conditions that we're working with that now meets that new requirement of identity being the perimeter security. We've mentioned that conditional access just a few minutes ago. It's going to then bring in the new identity IDs of principal IDs of system assigned managed identity, a user assigned managed identity, that the applications can have their own identities that they're working with. So we've seen a broader range of this and how they apply using conditional access to meet the security requirements of users using applications to gain access to resources. So thank you for joining me in this journey. I look forward to seeing you in another recording.